Vajradevi and Diana, if you could mute, that would be good. And thank you, Vajradevi, for remembering to record. I completely forgot about that. So we're trying to remember to record these sessions and experiment with getting them up on the website so that people can access them after the evening if they're not able to make the evening. So this evening, I'm going to follow on from Akasharaja from last week, talking about another pair of the worldly winds. Last week, Akasharaja, many of you were here, talked about fame and infamy, or status and disgrace. And yeah, I think we've got a good sense of how we get blown around by that particular worldly wind. But it's the same with all of them. It's very tiring, and it increases the amount of craving we have towards the pleasant side of the worldly wind and the aversion towards the difficult or unpleasant side of it. And what we're looking for when we're not blown around by the worldly winds is the sense of standing in our own ground, a sense of objectivity and of being able to see things more clearly, more objectively. If you like, the craving and the aversion, there are subjective responses that we're pulled around, whipped up by these different winds. So when it sort of came time to choose which evening, which of us were going to do, and several of us from the trustees meeting are leading these evenings, I had a very clear response towards praise and blame. That was the pair. I sort of didn't really want to do them, but I knew that they were the pair that I was most they were most relevant, if you like. Particularly the blame part of things. I think I work quite strongly with blame and feel quite vulnerable to feelings of either being blamed and criticised, but also I think is something of a tendency that I've had to work with quite a lot and still work with it's when we don't quite take responsibility for ourselves, isn't it? Blame. We put something out. It's their fault, or it's all my fault. It's all my fault. I was recalling today that two of my sort of most common childhood calls, if you like. I'm one of six. I'm the oldest of six kids. So we're constantly sort of blaming each other for things. It's not Mum, it wasn't me, it was her, it wasn't her, it's not my fault. So those sorts of voices are sort of were just the natural currency of my childhood. Whenever there was something that was a bit unfair or I hadn't done or I didn't want to admit to having done. So it goes back a long way, I think. So I think it's blame is a particularly sort of painful mind state when we're identified with it, when we're not able to see it just clearly for what it is. The experience can be very very painful to feel blamed by somebody else, but also when we blame others. At this slightly slightly extreme response today. It was a bit like standing in dog shit, something really unpleasant, really about the feeling, particularly of blaming somebody else. It doesn't feel clean. It's not a good feeling, even if I get away with it, if you like. It leaves this slightly sort of feeling, unclean. Like I'm trying to sort of get this dog shit off myself, and even if I'm only rubbing it onto the pavement, it still feels a bit unpleasant. So I think when we buy into the wind of praise, if you like, it can take us to a place of enchantment. Everything's lovely. It's a world where people say nice things about us. We feel good about ourselves. It's that place of enchantment. But blame can take us, if you like, to a place of hell. It's quite a hellish state, I think, at times. But they are both states that we will experience quite frequently. They're part of the worldly winds. Praise and blame, praise and blame. We'll probably, to a greater or lesser degree, go between the two of them. Sometimes we'll be experiencing the praise end of things when people like what we do, or they are encouraging, or they compliment us. And other times, whatever we do won't meet that sort of response. It will meet the opposite response when we're blamed or criticized. And that may be fair, or it might not be fair. It might feel quite unfair. But the point is how we respond, how we're able to be with when either of those things come our way. How resilient are we in relation to the winds of praise and blame? And it is natural to enjoy compliments, though actually not everybody does. Some people are quite uncomfortable. So we've got a whole mixture of ways of responding to the winds. But I think both sides of this pair of worldly winds, as they all do, affect our sense of self. They impact on our sense of self. And I think generally praise, it soothes and augments and polishes and confirms a sense of who we are, positive sense of self. Sometimes a sense of being a bit more than we thought we were. Whereas blame, it can, as I said, can feel quite painful, hit that sense of self where we feel we're defending something, we're under attack, we feel under attack with blame, a sense of defensiveness. And perhaps we're being seen as less than we think we are. So whether our sense of self is inflated through praise or it's assaulted through blame, we're reinforcing that sense of self through our siding or identifying with that, with either side of the worldly wind. So the more that we're able to identify and recognize the worldly winds themselves, this is praise. This is praise. What does that feel like? Oh, I can feel that slightly sort of puffing up in myself. Oh, I'm really enjoying this. And it's not that there's anything wrong, but it can get, an overinflation will at some point lead to deflation. There's this natural rhythm between the two of them. So the more we buy into the inflation, the more painful the sense of deflation will be when that criticism, sense of blame comes. So I want to talk a little bit about them separately, the worldly winds. I mean, I just want to say a few things really about both of them. And I'm not particularly going to make much of a distinction between when we're on the giving out of praise and blame or when we're on the receiving side of praise and blame. It'll be a little bit interchangeable. But I want to start with a story which probably will be familiar to many of you, but probably not all of you. And it's the story of a Japanese Zen monk, quite an accomplished monk called Hakuin, who was born in 1686 in Japan. So a long time ago, this is one of the main stories that's come through about him. So he was living in the village, or just outside the village, in his hermitage. And he was very, very well regarded by the villagers. Maybe it was quite a large village, so he was quite well looked after by the villagers. And around that time, one of the local girls became pregnant. She refused to say who the father was. She was very upset. But eventually she blamed Hakuin. She said, it was him. It was him. He made me pregnant. And there was a lot of shock, and there was a lot of horror that this man that they'd respected had done this thing. And so he was given quite a hard time for this. He was blamed for this behavior. So the baby was born, and when the baby was born, the parents actually took the baby to the monastery, and they said, "You did this, so you look after this child." When Hakuin was initially blamed for this, he didn't really respond. He didn't really say anything but, "Is that so?" Yeah, there's a lot coming his way. He didn't respond in kind. He simply said, "Is that so?" When they took the baby to him and said, "You did this, you'll look after this child." Again, simply, "Is that so?" So his life changed a bit. So rather than doing a lot of formal practice, he was on rearing baby duties. That was his life. That was his life, and it became his practice. And that went on. The stories vary. It went on in some cases, they say for a year, but in other cases for a few years. And eventually the young girl, she felt very bad about what she'd done because she had lied. And she confessed and said it wasn't Hakuin at all. It was the guy in the fish market who left town shortly afterwards. And so the villagers went back to Hakuin, and they said, "We're really sorry. We know now she's told the truth. We're really sorry. It wasn't your fault. And we're going to take the baby back. We're going to take the child back, and his mother is going to rear him." Again, Hakuin was very equanimous with and he simply said, "Is that so? Is that so?" He didn't buy into either praise or blame. He didn't get into defending himself, defending his reputation. He didn't reject what was being asked of him, but he simply was equanimous with the situation and just carried on practicing within conditions as they changed. So that's probably not how most of us would respond. I think it's often we get quite upset or angry when we feel blamed, and we don't feel seen, we don't feel heard. And I think why I felt I responded to this particular pair was I think perhaps for many of us like this, there's history, we have certain sort of conditioned tendencies around blaming, around being blamed for something, and the need to defend ourselves. So one of the things I think can happen is that we can start to, if we feel that we're quite sensitive to criticism or sensitive to being blamed, or we get quite angry and upset about it, we can end up blaming ourselves for blaming. We get into this loop that goes on, give ourselves a hard time for not being able to accept what's happening, not being equanimous. And I think what can really help is to learn to stay with the feelings. This is not use in Dharma practice, this is what we're aiming to do a lot of the time, is just rather than going into the story of the rights and wrongs of what's happened, but to simply stay with the feeling. And as I said, it can be quite a strong feeling, quite an unpleasant feeling, and the urge to justify, the urge to defend or to blame can be very strong. But the more that we're able to just stay with the feeling and recognize it as a feeling, can really help. We come to see that we can bear with very strong feelings. We can bear with what's happening without going into all this justification, all these rationalizations, all this the story of blaming that makes it even more uncomfortable to bear with, even more painful. And I've found that little sequence of steps to recognize what's happening. Oh, it's a painful feeling. To stay with that feeling, and then to know that feeling as simply a feeling. I found that again and again and again and again, a really helpful little sequence. And knowing the feeling is just a feeling takes us into the territory that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago in terms of the lakshanas, the stressfulness, the inconstancy, and the impermanent nature of experience. If we stay with a feeling and know a feeling simply as a feeling, at some point it will change. At some point we will see that it's not there forever. And we can allow it to go into change. We can see that it's inconstant. It comes and goes. The intensity of it even comes and goes. And we can see that it's not me. It's simply a feeling. It's arisen on the basis of certain conditions, and when those conditions change, which can often be one of the conditions that is most helpful, is a calm, aware mind that's able to just allow the feeling to be there. Just a feeling. So eventually, along the way, we learn to have a different attitude, if you like. We find that there are more and more occasions where we are able to hear a criticism or hear a different point of view, to get something wrong and perhaps have somebody blame us or not like that. And hear it in a different way, hear it with a bit more calm, a bit more sort of openness to somebody else's perspective. We can have the attitude, is that so? Is that so? Let me think about that. Let me see what I think about that, whether that's true or not. So truths. Vajradevi talks about, in relation to this pair, he talks about the Dharma door to praise and blame being truth or truthfulness. And he links it with objectivity, being able to see what's actually going on. And I was thinking about this in relation to my own family. Just recently, my family have had some, it's a large family, so it's only a part of it, but I've had some sort of falling out. One sister works for another sister. They work remotely, and there's been a falling out. And my dad, bless him, has just waded in, listened to one sister's side of the story, and then had a few words with the other sister, which didn't go down well. And I think this is really interesting. It's really interesting how we can feel that we've heard the truth of something and forget that we've just heard one side of it. It's really easy to do. I could feel it in myself. I'd heard my one sister's, I'd heard her sort of grouses, and I thought, oh yeah, I could see how that could happen. I could see the other sister. I could see why that might be the case. It didn't particularly affect me. But when I actually talked to the other sister to try and sort of to see if I could help in any way really with the situation, I learned all these things that I had not taken into account before. So even though I wasn't like my dad and I didn't wade in and give her a piece of my mind, and I went in quite openly, just interested to sort of hear how she was, how she'd been affected by it, I could see that actually I had, to a lesser extent than my dad, but to some extent, judged on limited information. So I think being aware of that tendency to make a whole truth out of one side of a story, out of a half a story. Yeah, so we can be aware of bias. That's a way of putting it. We can just be aware of the biases in our own minds. So I want to tell maybe one final little story in relation to blame. So blaming, when we blame others, it starts in the mind. Actually, when we blame ourselves, it's the same thing. It starts in the mind. We tell stories to ourselves. We tell ourselves what's happened. And in limited information often comes in here, or a certain bias in the mind towards it's a very particular story we're telling ourselves. A story will feed certain feelings, perhaps a feeling of self-righteousness. And if we bring in awareness at this point, if we recognize, the mind is starting to tell stories, there's this feeling of self-righteousness, there's the beginnings of disgruntlement or aversion towards that person. If we bring awareness in, then it can change the story. But if we don't, those stories that we tell ourselves usually come out of our mouths at some point, come out in speech. Sometimes the journey between what we think and what we say is a very short one. This was, I think what my dad saw. And so sometimes there's more reflection along the way. That can help. So this little story is one that Joseph Goldstein, the American Dharma teacher, tells. And he decided to experiment. He decided to not say anything over a period of a few months, or to lessen as much as he could saying anything about a third person. So if that person was not present, he would not say anything about them to the person that he was with. And he found it very interesting to note what happened over those few months. So the first thing was that it cut down what he said by a huge amount. I couldn't find this in the book, but I think I've heard him tell the story, and I think it's something like 70% of what he said just got cut out. So that's really interesting. If we really talk that much about other people and about somebody who's not there. It's a bit hard to imagine it's that much, but if we include, politicians that we're talking about, then it probably does get somewhere up there. So he spoke a lot less. What he found really striking was he made far fewer judgments. The judgmental thoughts that ended up in judgmental comments or comments of blame or criticism, the thoughts never got as far as speech. So over time, the thoughts lessened. If you like, he wasn't feeding them by speaking them, so they just lessened. He became far less judgmental about others. And one final thing he noted was that judgment also affected how he thought about himself. He actually became far less judgmental. So I found that really interesting. Quite a lot to come out of one little experiment, a little experiment with cutting down, talking about speaking to other people. But there was more. So he found when he did speak, his speech was less self-referential. He talked about himself less. And that desire to do so, that desire to, if you like, present ourselves as the center of our own world, diminished over time. He became less center stage in his own mind, and therefore in how he spoke. Yeah. So that's all I want to say about blame. That's enough. I want to say a bit about praise, the other side of the story. So I don't know if I've got what I'm about to say quite right, but this is what I remember. Some of you may well know this, but apparently children, so psychologists say, it's recommended with children that you be quite specific about what you praise them for, quite specific about the positive qualities, or that they're working really hard, rather than very general, oh, that's wonderful, you're wonderful. And apparently by being quite general a lot of the time, it can lead to children not really trying to do their best, because everything they do is great, or anything. They don't quite know how to distinguish and how to make something better. So this is what I've heard. And the message seems to be that kids need both unconditional love for just who they are. Just you telling them that you love them and that they are wonderful, but combined with honesty about their actions and their performance. That goal you scored this afternoon was great, but did you notice how you weren't passing the ball to the others? That sort of thing. And it stands to reason, I think, that adults are the same. That we need this to be loved for who we are, but also this sense of honest feedback at times. Sangharakshita has this phrase, honest collision is better than dishonest collusion. Honest collision is better than dishonest collusion. So he's saying that for friends, it's okay if you rub up against each other, if you disagree at times. If you can do it well, if you can do it from that basis of love for each other and respect and kindness. So I think it's important to distinguish, if you like, wholesome and unwholesome aspects of praise. Helpful or wholesome praise where there's encouragement, recognition of your qualities or somebody else's qualities, a delighting in those good qualities, such as kindness, or where they act really well. And there's a practice which I know many of you have done lots of times, and some of you probably haven't done at all. A practice called rejoicing in merits. So there's a verse in the puja where we rejoice in the merits of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So this is where we rejoice in each other. So it's you're not just saying, oh, you're great. It's that specific thing again. It's what do I like about this person? What do I really appreciate and what do I think is of real value in this person. So it's thoughtful and truthful. I really appreciate your generosity of spirit and your generosity with. So it's you can relate what you're saying to attitudes and actions that you've noticed in that person. So it requires quite a lot of paying attention, attentiveness to what you notice about your friend. So how it's done generally is you might do it one-to-one, but often it's done in a group. So one person will be in the hot seat and everybody else will just go around the room, and they'll have a certain amount of time to say what they really appreciate about you. So it's a practice to both rejoice. It's a practice, to be able to rejoice in someone, but it's quite a practice as well to allow yourself to be rejoiced in, and to take that positive feedback. And when I've done it in some quite big groups over the years, and you see a lot of wriggling. It's like, oh my God, it's quite hard to sit sometimes when there's so much positivity coming your way. So Bhante Sanghareshta famously and mischievously said, with positive rejoicings, we should be able to say, I'm glad you noticed, when somebody says something nice to us. So you could try that. You could try, is that so? And I'm glad you noticed. So maybe just a couple of things to look out for with praise. So we can enjoy praise and compliments, but I think it's really helpful to notice when or if we become a bit dependent upon them, when we start to need them. And sometimes this might not be obvious. I think I teach quite a bit at retreat centres, and often at the end of retreats, there's a lot of people have such a lot of goodwill and positivity often that's built up by the end of the retreat, and there's a lot of positivity comes my way and the way of the team, and it's absolutely lovely. But I do remember being on one retreat where the focus had been a bit different, had been quite broad, so the teaching was a relatively small part of it. I actually wrote a blog about this. And we went around the circle at the end, and almost nobody said anything about the teaching or about me. And about halfway through, I started to notice this, and for the rest of the way around, I was sort of working with this desire for praise, this desire for recognition, and then the thoughts that started coming about, oh, maybe I just wasn't on form, maybe I just was hopeless this week, all this sort of stuff going on. So initially, when you get quite a lot of praise, it can feel like I don't really mind either way if I get it or not. But when you don't get it, that's interesting, and that can reveal. Or when somebody else gets it, maybe you're co-teaching or something, and the other person gets loads of positive and you don't. That can show up the dependency or the attachment to praise. And a dependence on others' opinion of us. And I think, as has been said a few times, the worldly winds are so much about noticing when we're blown around, and noticing what it's like when we're not, when we can just stand our ground, stand in the balance of equanimity. So one of the things I do when I've lost balance, and this is usually when I've lost balance and gone from praise into blame. self-blame particularly. So I used to do this thing where I'd just write down 10 rejoicings in myself. I'd make them quite specific, and if possible, I'd make them related to that day. 10 things that I appreciated and valued about myself. And if I didn't feel better at the end of 10, if I still felt judgmental or I still felt down on myself, I would make myself write 10 more. And by the end of the second 10, I usually felt all right. I felt there was something, there was a little bit more balance in the mind. So I think it's a bit similar to a gratitude practice that I've heard some of you talk about recently. But I think with that rejoicings, I think it's particularly helpful to self-metta, when self-metta has just taken a bit of a nosedive. And again, we need to find some equilibrium, some positivity in ourselves. So something to watch out perhaps when we give praise. And again, it's to do with the biases that I talked about in relation to blame. So praise becomes mixed up with approval. I'm praising you because you did something the way that I like it. Something that the way that I approve. It fits in with my own sort of biases. So sometimes we praise things that we know we do quite well ourselves. So there's a bit of sort of reinforcing ourselves while reinforcing another. So it can be useful just to watch out for that. And another thing to watch out for is praising while making a comparison. It sort of muddies the waters a little bit. I really liked when you did that. You were way better than anybody else. It's like, how do I receive that? How do I receive that you like what I did, but it's like a negative comparison with somebody else? So either that can be a bit uncomfortable to receive, or it can end up that we feel a bit superior. I'm better than everybody else. Not only was it maybe I did something well at work, I did it better than the rest of the team did that week or something. Okay, so there's one final image maybe to just bring to mind that I often think of when I'm talking about equanimity and standing our ground and not being blown around by the winds. And that's, can't see my hand, but that's the earth touching mudra of the Buddha. When the Buddha touches the earth, if you like, that balance, that equanimity in relation to worldly winds comes from our faith and confidence in our practice, and our faith and confidence in ourselves as practitioners, as followers of the Buddha's way. So our own values, our own ethical practice can really help connect with that sense of confidence in our ground. There's something about having, I know it's talked about with having a clean conscience. When you have a clean conscience, you can not be blown about so easily. And I think with this pair of worldly winds, one of the things, the last thing to leave you with that really helps, I think, is forgiveness. Learning, in a way, having the kindness to admit when we've not got something right, when we've got it wrong even. Admitting our faults and then forgiving ourselves for them as best we can. Forgiving the faults of ourselves and forgiving the faults of others. when it comes down to it, we're all doing the best that we can. Sometimes that best is better than others, but we're all doing the best that we can. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Maybe you can stop recording, Vajradevi.